Welcome back to another episode of Haunted and Historic Australia's Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. This episode we're on to part 2 of The Perfect Poisoners with the Ferryman. In last week's episode, we looked at the Black Widow, Louisa Collins, poisoning not one husband, but 2. This episode, George Dean has been accused of poisoning his wife. But the strange situation is that she's only just had a baby with him. And it's very hard to work out why he would do this. But let's start from George's story at the beginning. George was born in a small town of Albury in New South Wales in the November of 1867. It is believed that he didn't have quite as nice a childhood as others, where at the age of 13 he steals a horse and is fined £25. His father, perhaps around this time, commits suicide, and his mother is left with 6 children, George being the eldest. She does meet another man, a Mr. Finch, and is married again, and has other children, so perhaps George had to grow up quite quickly. Now, it is believed that he moved to Sydney and worked for a time as a blacksmith. Then he also worked as an assistant to a butcher, then as a deckhand. So he's taking on many jobs, whether he couldn't find his own niche or perhaps didn't work with others very well. It seems that he's jumping from job to job until he finds one that he likes. By 1884, it seems that he's now working for the North Shore Steam Ferry Company and receives a master's certificate in 1888. By 1890, he becomes the night master of the Possum, a ferry operating between Circular Quay and Milson's Point. This is where he found his home and is quite liked amongst his peers. He meets Mary in 1893. But Mary isn't really Mary. Her name was recorded as Sarah Annie Gaynor. At her birth, she was born on the 16th of May, 1874. Now it seems that Mary, or Sarah Annie Gaynor, is only 19 when she meets George, a young lady, and her mother is a Carolyn Seymour. However, her mother Carolyn also goes by the name of Catherine Asbury, or McEwen, or Odoms. It seems that Mary's mother has a different past, and I think what's happened here is that they've changed their name to Seymour to cover this past, and this will come to light further on in the story. George Dean meets Mary Seymour at a picnic at the harbour resort of Cabarita. They were attracted to each other at first sight, but it wasn't until a few weeks later that Dean was riding his bicycle to the ocean beach at Coogee and noticed some lemons in a shop on Riley Street in Surrey Hills. He jumped off his bike and went in, and there behind the counter stood Mary Seymour. From here they started their relationship. George and Mary married in March of 1894. George was a man in his late 20s, a handsome, likeable chap, and somewhat of a hero in the area. He'd been working on the ferries for some time and had even rescued 2 ladies who had misstepped and ended up in the murky waters of Sydney Harbour. What a great man! And even when he was arrested, people couldn't believe. Why? From the outset, the couple couldn't have been happier. They were expecting a baby, and Mary had her mother living with them at that moment just to help out. It should have been a wonderful time, but it wasn't. George Dean fought with the mother-in-law. They never got on, and it was uncomfortable in the house. She stayed for a little while, helping Mary handle having a new child around, and George kept working as a ferryman. While Mary's mother was staying there, she would make meals for them, and on one occasion prepared some oats in the morning for Mary. She left it upon the kitchen table to cool before Mary came out and ate it. Mary ate most of the oats, and whatever was left her mother finished. They were both violently ill for some days. A few days later, after they'd recovered, Mrs. Seymour made some beef broth for their dinner. She left it to cool on the stove top and assisted Mary with the baby. Later they sat down to eat it. Mary said that it tasted quite bitter. They agreed and threw it out. On both occasions that Mrs. Seymour had made these meals, George was home. By the end of January, Mrs. Seymour left the home and went back to her own. Mary seemed to be doing quite well. She was able to start making meals again. On the 25th of February, Mary took the baby and went down to the local grocer, owned by Mrs. Adey. She bought a bottle of lemon syrup. Afterwards, Mrs. Adey came home with her, probably awing over the baby. They had some of the lemon syrup and Mrs. Adey left. Mary continued to use the lemon syrup until the 1st of March, but noticed that there was something wrong with it. On the 1st of March, she had some words with her husband. She asked him to mind the baby. He refused, as he had no time and was heading out. A little before this, he had complained that Mary wasn't keeping the baby or the home clean, and Mary suspected he was seeing another woman. If they were honest, their relationship had gone downhill ever since they got married and then found out they were having a baby. And with Mrs. Seymour hanging around, George became disinterested in this relationship any longer. He'd grown cold toward Mary, and now he had left the house. She settled the baby down and then went to bed herself. The next morning, Saturday the 2nd of March, she got up and went to the kitchen. She got herself a clean glass and poured some of the lemon syrup in. After having a few sips, she noticed a bitter taste. It was very similar to that of that beef stew that her mother had cooked. She thought it was very strange, but then went on with her day anyway, until George came home. George came in and she'd prepared breakfast for him. They sat down and had breakfast, but it was very shortly after that Mary started to feel very sick and started vomiting again. She knew right away that what had made her sick all those weeks back was making her sick again. Something, that bitter taste which she'd had from those oats and then with the beef stew. She knew something foul was at play. After George had gone to sleep, being a night worker, he had to sleep during the day, Mary took baby Florence and went to see Mrs. Adey. She took the bottle with her of the lemon syrup and told Mrs. Adey that she thought there was something funny about it. After such discussion with another lady, Mrs. Walker, they decided to take the lemon syrup to the chemist, Mr. R.J. Smith, to see if he could work out what was wrong with it. They'd only had the lemon syrup a week ago together, and it was perfectly fine. Neither of them had been sick. And now Mary felt awful. She had to get to the bottom of it. So she left the bottle with Mr. R.J. Smith, the chemist, hoping that he would get back to her. He never did. She went home, still quite ill, and didn't have dinner. She went to bed just as George was getting up to do his shift on the Possum. Acting as such a loving husband, he got her a drink of stout, which is like an ale. She had the drink and felt a little easier and went to sleep. Still quite ill the next morning, George came in to see how she was after he arrived back home after his shift. She said she was still quite ill, so he suggested he would get her another stout like he had the night before, as this seemed to settle her stomach at the time. He walked away and came back into the room holding the glass. There was nothing in it, but he had his hands wrapped tightly around the bottom of the glass. He turned his back to her and poured the liquid in. She was very suspicious, and he picked up on this and said, "Oh, it doesn't look right. It must be a bit off, or something might be in it. I'll go and toss it out and do another one." And he left the room and didn't return. She thought this was quite strange, but being as ill as she was, she just kind of closed her eyes again. An hour later, George brought her a cup of tea in bed. He seemed to be such a dutiful husband. But she noticed a whitish film around the edges of the cup. When he left the room, she poured it into a tumbler and hid it. On Monday afternoon, the doctor called by. George must have called the doctor to come and visit his wife, expecting her to be a lot sicker than she was. But she hadn't drank the tea, although she was still feeling the effects of the lemon syrup that she'd given herself the couple of days before. When Dr. Newmark arrived, he checked Mary over, felt her temperature, and said that he would leave some medication for her to have a bit later, but to get a lot of rest and drink a lot of fluids. George said that he would prepare the medicine for her as Mary was still in a sick state. He mixed some powder with it, and Mary noticed this. She inquired as to why he was mixing powder. He stated that was what the doctor instructed him to do. She took it despite her reservations, and by midnight she was seriously ill. The doctor came back the next day, and while George was in the room, Mary asked the doctor whether he'd prescribed powder to be mixed with the medicine. The doctor said no, and George denied ever seeing any powder. She knew he was trying to kill her. The doctor took away Mary's stained nightdress for analysis, and the following Wednesday, her mother called. Mary gave her the tumbler of tea that she'd had hiding in her room. Her mother took it to the doctor, and they handed it to police. The cold tea was found to contain elements of both arsenic and strychnine, and on Saturday, March the 9th of 1895, George Dean was arrested. The town was so confused. He was such a lovely man, and so was Mary. Their lives looked so perfect, and the new baby? What on earth was going on? At the court hearing, George Dean was being represented by a young criminal lawyer named Richard Marr. He was even about the same age as George, in his late 20s. Throughout the trial, Richard was more or less not so much defending George Dean's actions, but trying to accuse Mrs. Seymour, Mary's mother, of not being such a great character. During the court case, Richard asked Mary many questions, trying to make her look incompetent. Why on earth would you drink anything this man gave you if you suspected he was trying to kill you? And it was found that Mary didn't actually want the doctor called, but George was the one calling the doctor in. The lawyer questioned Mrs. Seymour, Mary's mother, also, not so much on what she thought of George Dean, but on her former life. He even asked if she'd done any time. Mrs. Seymour had actually been convicted of petty theft 30 years earlier. Apparently, Mrs. Seymour had taken in criminals into her home and had looked after a brothel while a madam was away. The lawyer Richard Marr tried to get the jury and the judge to see them not so innocent, but it was found that Mrs. Seymour may have done such things as boarding criminals or looking after a madam's brothel for some time. But apart from being convicted 30 years earlier, her background was quite flawless and was liked by many people. He didn't hold back information either about Mary's father, a Dennis Gaynor, who was never married to Mrs. Seymour. Dennis was in jail when Mary was born, and although her name was registered at the time of her birth as Sarah Annie Gaynor, without the marriage, Mrs. Seymour simply changed her name, and when Mary was 2 years and 9 months old, Carolyn was put in jail also for theft. Carolyn Seymour was known as Catherine Asbury, and after all this had happened, she changed her name to Mrs. Seymour and Mary to Mary Seymour, and setting up a fruit and veg business so as that Mary would have a less sinister life. Despite all of this, Mary was still raised across the road from a brothel, and hence why, on occasions, seedy characters and criminals may have been hanging out with Mrs. Seymour. It was a rough start to Mary's life, but you could hardly say this is how they lived now. And this has all come out in the court, with Richard Marr spilling the tea, so to speak. Richard seemed to find every witness he could that could state that George Dean was a lovely man and a Sydney hero. On many occasions that he saved the life of people in the harbour. This looked good for George Dean, the hero, up against the seedy past of Mrs. Seymour and Mary Dean. Richard Marr made it a point of cross-examining Mary Dean, pulling her up on things such as how come when she was so sick she was able to see other people, and also she had many times where she could have told Dr. Newmark that she had the tea that George had given her trying to poison her, but she waited and gave it to him only after discussing it with other people, such as Mrs. Addy and her mother. There were many other people that were brought forward to talk at this hearing. Dr. Newmark was brought forward to show the evidence he'd collected from her nightdress, which showed fecal matter that contained arsenic. And it was just after that he'd given all this information that Richard Marr brought to the attention of the court that Mary Dean was giggling or laughing. This looked badly for Mary Dean to be acting like this in a court, and the magistrate said, "You do realise, miss, that your husband is here for attempted murder?" It may have just been that Mary was somewhat embarrassed about the fact that they were holding up a nightdress with poop on it. Obviously, it's not a comfortable thing to have declared in a courtroom, but Richard made every effort to make it look as though she wasn't taking this whole thing seriously, as well as the fact many times he's made it look as though she was trying to poison herself, because why else would she not have died? Perhaps it was her masterminding the whole thing, trying to make it look as though he was poisoning her, so as that he would go to jail and she could meet someone else. It was also brought up in court that the fact that there was strychnine and arsenic found in her system was actually what caused her not to die. The amount of arsenic grains that were found in the things that she'd consumed should have killed her. But the fact that strychnine actually works as a cure for arsenic made it look really bad for Mary. Now, it looked like Mary was poisoning herself, but not quite enough to kill herself, which seems like a scheme. However, it also could be that the daft George Dean, who was trying to kill her with everything he could find in the cupboards, didn't realise he was actually keeping her alive instead of killing her. The plot at this stage thickens. Magistrate Giles ended the hearing and without question favourable toward Mr. Dean. After hearing Richard Marr talk, he was sure she was poisoning herself. Despite this, he advised the court that it would go to trial due to all the witnesses and evidence that had been put forward. The trial commenced on the 4th of April of 1895 at Sydney Central Criminal Court before Judge Windeyer, the hanging judge, and 12 members of a jury. As previously, the witnesses and evidence was brought forward once more, and Richard Marr did his best to discredit Mrs. Dean and Mrs. Seymour. George took the stand and declared under oath that he had never poisoned his wife and knows nothing as to how she could have become poisoned. Mary Dean also took the stand and advised how the relationship had gone south shortly after they were married, and she was pregnant with their baby. He had never gotten on with her mother, Mrs. Seymour, and she suspected he had tried to poison her on many occasions before she had her baby, as well as poisoning her mother. In January, she brought up that although she was still friends with a Maggie C, that her husband had said to her he would marry her once he was free of Mary. Judge Windeyer was clearly on the side of Mary Dean. He stated that the evidence that was put forward regarding Mrs. Seymour being incarcerated 30 years ago had no real evidence on this case, and he believed George Dean had poisoned his wife with the intent to harm or kill her. He turned to the jury with his final thought. He could not see how or why a woman with young child would be trying to poison herself over 5 times, and also poisoning her mother in the process, while caring and looking after a newborn baby. The jury took note and then took 8 hours to deliberate, only to be called out with no certain verdict. Judge Windeyer was confused as to how they did not see that George was clearly guilty. He almost reprimanded them, telling them that should they not come up with a verdict swiftly, they would be confined into their quarters until Monday. The jury spent 17 minutes after hearing this and came back with a guilty verdict, one that they believed Windeyer would have wanted. They did, however, recommend mercy. George Dean they did not want to be hung. However, Judge Windeyer noted he was condemned to execution on the 6th of April. Well, there was a backlash in Sydney. Many thought that this was an injustice. Many did not like the hanging Judge Windeyer, especially after the Mount Rennie case only a few years before. The case became known as the lemon syrup case or the Dean case, and they were less concerned about George Dean hanging, but more concerned about proving Judge Windeyer wrong or incompetent as a judge. A commission was called together to investigate this lemon syrup or Dean case, made up of Dr. Philip Sidney Jones, Dr. Frederick Manning and Francis Rogers QC, Queen's Counsel. After looking into the evidence and re-interviewing witnesses, they acknowledged that Judge Windeyer had a soft spot for the women and felt that George Dean did not get a fair trial. They ruled against Windeyer for Dean to be released on the grounds that there was not enough evidence to prove that it was he who poisoned his wife. The people of Sydney were very happy. They felt that George Dean, an innocent man, was now back on the possum. He did go back to work pretty much straight away. It had been 4 months. But things weren't back to normal as such. He was quite a bit of a novelty, and many people wanted to ride the possum just so they could see him. It caused quite a bit of flurry for some time. As for Mary Dean, she was able to claim some sort of alimony or child support because they were not living together anymore. She moved back in with her mother, I would assume, to look after the baby. And Dean possibly continued a relationship with this Maggie C. But that's not where the story ends. Oh no, not our stories. You see, Richard Marr, the lawyer, wants a bit more than just a lawyer job. Richard wanted a seat on the New South Wales Legislative Assembly and intended to get it. Richard went to a Julian Solomons, a close friend, someone who was quite high up in the judicial system. He was probably like a mentor to Richard, and discussed ways he could get into the Assembly. In doing this, though, at one point, he boasted how when George Dean was in Darlinghurst Jail being held for the trial, he thought he'd find out once and for all, just for himself out of curiosity, whether Dean actually tried to poison his wife Mary. So what he did, he went to Dean in the jail and said to him, "Oh, they found the chemist who sold you the poison," just to see what reaction he would get from him. Well, George Dean freaked out and confessed the whole thing. Apparently, he had gone to R.J. Smith, the chemist on their street, the local chemist, the same chemist in which Mary Dean had handed some sample and wanted him to check out for her, which he never did. And this is possibly why. Well, Richard Marr didn't know what to do. He couldn't let the case unravel now, it was right in the middle. He had to still get George Dean off if he wanted to have a successful career. So he kept quiet about the confession. And he just said to George Dean, you just keep saying what you've been saying and we'll get you off. And they did. And he was back on the possum after the commission came through and overruled Windia's decision. But now, Richard Marr has said this to Julian Solomons. What is Julian going to do? Well, he doesn't know what to do. He's having a moral affliction inside. He goes to someone else for advice. What should he do? Now, it's a little bit like Chinese whispers, but the word gets out. And soon someone has gone to Attorney General Jack Want with rumours that Dean confessed in jail. And what was he going to do about it? Well, on 24th of September, George Dean petitioned Parliament to clear his name, and the next day, Attorney General Jack Want read Solomon's account of Marr's conversation to the House. Well, the Daily Telegraph got involved. Everybody was involved. Richard Marr and the Daily Telegraph went at it in the papers, and a whole new commission was formed. Word got out to the public and everybody wanted to know what was going on. The newspapers were even saying, the Dean case again? During the conspiracy trial, a sad turn of events occurred. Mrs. Addy, who had been a help to Mrs. Dean back when the lemon syrup was poisoned, committed suicide after being subpoenaed to give evidence again at the Dean case. She took her own life at the thought of being dragged into this case once again. It was really sad, as she had received the subpoena and become very depressed. She threw herself in the well in the backyard and was found by her daughter. This case had not only taken its toll on the people who were involved, but also people that they knew and who they had involved. Sadly for Mrs. Addy, this would be her end. On October 25th, after much backwards and forwards in court, many tears among high society members, as well as a confession from R.J. Smith that he didn't sell the poison to George Dean, but had given him some poison. Apparently, George Dean had needed arsenic for a bike tyre he was repairing on his bike. And the strychnine? Well, I'm not too sure where that came into it. But R.J. Smith was reprimanded because he never voluntarily gave any information that could have helped the case months and months ago and possibly stopped an end to Mrs. Addy's life. It all came out in the courtroom. Richard Marr confessed and resigned from Parliament, stating, I am determined to endure mental torture no longer, nor to stifle the voice of truth. The awful lesson of my life I will endeavour to atone for in another clime. So, it was found that they were guilty of conspiracy. Not just Richard Marr, but his partner, Paddy Crick. A couple of people they had assist them, as well as a witness, Jane Reynolds, were all charged conspiring to pervert the course of justice, even though it is widely believed that Richard Marr alone knew about the confession, no one else. So this ruined a couple of them for a little while, but not so much that they didn't get high up positions in Parliament later on, like Lord Mayor. Even Paddy Crick ended up in a high position, but due to fraud later on was in trouble again. And as for George Dean, well, he went to jail, as he should have in the first place. George received 14 years for giving false information at a previous trial. For lying to the court and the people of Sydney, he would serve the majority of this sentence at Goulburn Jail. So the case unfolded The confession from George Dean. He did try and poison Mary Dean. Poor Mary Dean. She knew it, and they were all scoffing at her, stating that she wanted to kill herself after she'd only just had her little baby. Well, Mary Dean got out of it quite okay, I believe, in the end. She raised her daughter and was with another man in a happier life. As for Mrs. Seymour, she would have been there by Mary's side, helping her all the way, as their close relationship was. It's not written whether or not he continued a relationship with Maggie C, but I think she'd be more than a little worried that if he got bored with her, she might find a little bit of strychnine and arsenic. Oh, hang on, just the arsenic this time. We don't want to leave any stones unturned now. George Dean ended up released from jail in 1904 from Goulburn and was able to return as a ferryboat captain. It is not known if he worked back on the Possum, but he was definitely allowed to resume duties once more. But the days where he was known as a hero were over. Toward the end of his life, he returned to the Riverina area from which he was born and passed away in 1913 in the town of Hay. Well, what a strange case. That concludes our series on the perfect poisoners, the Black Widow and the Ferryman. Now, I'm sure we'll have many more culprits of poison in future stories. These, like many of our other stories, have so many twists and turns on Haunted and Historic Australia. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe and share, and also tap the notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more stories.